Good evening. Welcome to the Zena Star Salon. My guest today is Dr. Savita Singh, a professor in the School of Gender and Development Studies at the Indira Gandhi National University, Open University in New Delhi. She was formerly the Dean of the School for Gender and Development Studies, and responsibility in which she has done amazing work on both gender and development. In addition, Dr. Singh is a renowned poet in Hindi and a prolific writer in social theory. Our conversation today is going to focus on how we can imagine a post-COVID lifestyle. I am being very optimistic. We will see a post-COVID era. We will have a different lifestyle. And while we're suffering through one of the most intense phases of this pandemic, not only in India, but worldwide, it's really important that we look forward and we try and imagine how this break in time, in social relationships, and in culture, we will use this break to think of a new world. I welcome you, Dr. Savita Singh. I will call you Savita hereafter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Poonam. We are going to venture into an unimagined or imagined world. It'll be interesting how it sort of shapes up.
Absolutely. It takes courage to imagine positively. And it is our responsibility as professors, artists, social activists to give the spark to other people so that they too can fuel their imagination. So tell me what you're thinking about within this COVID world and what we might imagine afterwards. Let's have your initial thoughts about the subject.
I think, Poonam, the best way will be to just look at the life that is structured for us today. Look at the way we live, for example, because it is in the present, in the way that we live, that these pathogens have actually made an appearance. So we must understand as to how they have come into being. I mean, that is to say, in a manifested way, the way that they are interacting with human beings in a destructive way, rather. So very many people have written on this because all of us actually want to understand. But there is a socialist feminist way of looking at this world, and they have been saying and warning for a very long time that if we cross certain limits of how we consume and how we produce and how we interact with nature, we will have these what they are calling catastrophe capitalism. That is to say, we are not mindful of our limits. First of all, limits to how much we want to consume, how much we want to profit, and how much we want to waste. Because all three are a part of it. I mean, think of a world, say about 50 years ago, even, when the world was not corporatized in the way it is today. That is to say, complete dictate, as I would say, of what we should consume, for example. What kind of food we should eat, what kind of medicines we should have. Everything else, that is the multiple ways of thinking and being that was very much accepted, is now slowly and gradually becoming out of date, pushed out of the center of life. And to the extent that it is, after some time, I feel before this, the pandemic has come, we wouldn't have even imagined that people had a different kind of lifestyle. People lived in different ways. I mean, people lived in villages, for example, or in kasbas in India. They had different lifestyle than people who were living in the metropolis. Now you go to these places and you will find that there is a duplication of the same kind of life that people are leading in metropolis. Duplication in the sense that there is an duplication of the aspiration. And that aspiration itself leads to breaking certain boundaries which are very much contextually legitimate, right? So, I mean, in today's world, how can anybody say that if you're living in a village, you lead a simple life? I live in a city, I lead a sophisticated life. You cannot say today, because these options are not given to any individual. The options that are given to everyone are determined and decided by the marketing strategies of big corporations, right?
And may I add that this aspiration is not just of the villager to the... I'm sorry, there's a disturbance. I was going to say that this aspiration is not just for the rural person to aspire to an urban life. Actually, this has its origins in the urban Indian aspiring to a Western lifestyle. So there is a chain reaction going on. And
coming to that, yeah.
And so we first have to examine and break that aspiration, that the lifestyle, the organic lifestyle that should have been the lifestyle of the Indian or the subcontinent in a healthy, indigenous way, has already been disrupted by this imitation of the so-called modernity of the West. So the rural lifestyle is twice revealed. Can you say something about that? And how do you think that we can reverse this trend? Because it seems to be a momentum and a cycle that seems to have run away from. So COVID is just another symptom of a runaway system. How can we arrest that system and how can we reverse it?
Yeah, so the thing is, when I was saying that this duplication or replication of aspiration basically is provided by commodity fetishism, as one would say. People's aspirations are not to lead better life in terms of healthy life, right? Aspirations are to have as many commodities in your life as possible. That is the difference, because this system, capitalist world, is a world of commodities, basically, and of commodification. If I have to explain this, I'll explain later, maybe. That is to say, everything has to be done or produced for profit. There are two kinds of values for which we do many things in life: production and reproduction. One is called use value, that is to say that things that we need, and socially and individually, things that we need, we produce. And it has been going on for time immemorial. People have been producing, pots. If they have to cook food, they will produce pots, isn't it? But how many kinds of pots, for example, is when you enter into another realm of creation of value, which is exchange value. That is to say, you don't produce for the need, but you produce for the profit. Buy please this one because it is better than the one that you've been using, and it has this technology and that beauty and this color. So that's how you enter into making it look like a thing to be aspired for, thing to be possessed, for which you should pay a certain amount of money. So this simple looking logic, simple attitude, that people are not aware as to what it is creating, what kind of havoc it is creating. Because more and more you produce the same kind of thing which satisfies your use value, more and more you take from nature in terms of its resources. So the overproduction of anything not only damages capitalism ultimately, because then it reduces it leads to crisis in capitalism. Overproduction always pushes down the prices of things. If there are many more things, then the prices will go down. So the certain balance has to be maintained. But not only this, it is bad for capitalism, it is really bad for the entire earth. So what I was saying is that pandemic is not something that came out of Wuhan's lab. It came out of, or it is located in our relations of production and our ways, the ways we produce and we consume. It is here that the pathogen is located. If we understand this, then we can move on. That is to say, now I was reading just a few days ago that this particular phase of capitalism, which we call monopoly capitalism or neoliberal phase, globalized capitalism, is the reason why you have the pandemic. Right? Viruses you would have had in your country or in your society for a very long time, but for it to become a pandemic, you needed very many other conditions to be fulfilled. For example, a global network of commodity exchange. All right, a marvelous, efficient communication system. The development of aviation industry in the world. People are traveling in hours, they're traveling from one continent to the other. And how can you ever stop anybody from traveling? Everyone is, important, whoever is traveling, and they have legitimate causes and reasons to travel. So things just got interconnected in such a way that the pandemic has come into being. Now, since we are talking in a very sensible manner, I think, Poonam, because we're looking at the real causes of why this particular thing has appeared, the pathogen that we are discussing, that it is not located here in this lab or that lab. It is located in the world that we have created of commodities and its exchanges and the networks, and super profiting by the corporations, allowing people not to consume things that they locally produce. Look at the peasant movement this time in the country. One has to understand why India wanted agriculture to be shaped through corporate needs of acquisition of lands and the things that would be produced, the agriculture produce. It is the control on the produce that was the main reason why these laws were put together, and Indian peasants, farmers, they protested because they understood that it will not be just the production of certain kind of grains and all that. It will basically be it's a world trend of de-peasantization of the country. They will lose the vocation of producing and choosing, as it's very difficult for them to choose things that they want to produce, because the market is still controlled by the big money in this country. But even little bit control that they had over their land would be gone. And it would have meant, I can tell you that the permanent location of these pathogens in India, you would not have been able to, not to say that you will be able to eradicate now, but then it would have been very difficult, because all the conditions that lead to production of these viruses and pathogens were going to be met through this whole process. So we have to understand that it is this, that is the locale, that is the matrix within which life-destroying, anti-life viruses are now spreading their wings and finding themselves very comfortably located. I can tell you what is the real challenge to these pathogens. For example, tell me if they are becoming more and more comfortable with us to our own disadvantage. So this is a thing. So the post-COVID world that we are going to imagine, or we are going to think about, we have to see what all we have done to deal with this, because it is located in the way we live, in the way we produce goods, and the way we control them, and the way we profit from them, and the way we consume them.
So let me shift the focus. Of course, yours is a very comprehensive and deeply thought explanation for the economy of this pathogen. I know that some products are necessary, but what has also happened is that we have focused on the consumption of products rather than the consumption, let's say, of ideas, consumption of art, the consumption of folk practices. And obviously that has taken a backseat. As a humanities person, as a person trained in literature and film, I want to ask, how can we encourage people to shift the focus from products that are manufactured to artistic expression?
Yeah, so I think that is the place where we can repose some hope. Rightly, you just pointed out that is the area where we can look for some ways, because that area still has some space for alternative imagination. But when art also becomes part of the same production process, it joins the same economy.
True.
Then there is absolutely, of course, no, it's not a good thing to happen for anybody to sort of fight it out, So production as art as production, in the way the other things are being produced as commodities, that is we should leave out, because then it is the same logic that will apply. But art, poetry, and all these forms of human expression, they have progressed because of oppositional thinking, because of transcendent thinking, because of out of the world ways of locating certain possibilities. So in the realm of potentials and possibilities, artists can go. People who work in culture, for example, can go. They can give you imaginations. They can share their imaginations with you. Now, the post-COVID world, frankly speaking, is an imagination at the moment. I thought through, since you've spoken to me about it, I thought through it in so many ways, and I found that the basis for its the basis in reality for it to happen, our society is transitioning into a newer world, is very tough. That kind of imagination, so many people have imagined a socialist world, and that socialist experiment fails and fails time and again. The pressure of capitalism and capitalist logic is so overwhelming, because you see, what capitalism also does is that it has perfected also the production of war. So if they cannot beat you, the system cannot beat a socialist system, it engages that socialist world or experiment into a huge war. So Cold War started. You look at even today, how many wars are being waged on this earth, and they all have an impact on nature. They all have impact on women. They all impact this world in such a way that imagining something post-COVID-like situation, which is a socialist imagination, becomes more and more difficult. There is just so much pressure not to imagine something alternatively, because we are so caught up in terms of life and death with the system that imagining becomes very difficult. After I have said this, still human beings cannot be stopped from imagining, cannot be stopped from thinking of a better life. After all, we have gone through very, very many pandemics, and we've gone through world wars and so on and so forth, and we've built film industries, we've filled art movements, we've created greater poetry. I mean, we have continued to do that. But I frankly am telling you, Poonam, that this time the danger is very grave. And art and literature will have marginal role to play in terms of transitioning this into a better time, a better situation. So given the fact that I think that my role or our role, or people who write poetry, fiction, this and that, their role is limited. Nevertheless, even this is important, and we should be talking about it. So a post-COVID world will naturally be a world that will not be based on production of commodities. Very important. That is to say, artists have to be critical about turning their art into commodities. That is something the critical role that has to be played by them. So what kind of art? Can we can we consume in terms of daily use things? Can we consume things that we prepare at home, not packaged food, for example? Can we prepare our food wholly within our kitchens, for example? Can we use grains that are not grown by the corporatized agriculture? Meaning to say, can we encourage farmers with small plots, for example, who produce different kind of grains? Is it possible? I mean, can someone survive today by producing something that has no market?
And yet, I was also thinking along these lines, we don't want to be over optimistic. We don't want to sell a fairy tale. We recognize the difficulty of starting a different lifestyle. And I personally have taken great pains to kind of devolve my practice of cooking or cleaning. I don't want to hire somebody to come and clean my place, because I want that to be an intentional effort to not just clean my space, but make it sacred. And there's a big difference between that. I want to say cooking is a performance as well as the cooking of food that we absolutely must eat. Cooking and distributing the food that we cook in informal ways, whether it is to my landlord or to my parents or to my friends. I've decided that my cooking should be a performance to myself and within myself, but also an informal exchange system. So what we used to do by way of necessity is that we used to make a batch of achar or chutney or whatever, and we would distribute it. Now, because these things are readily available in the market, nobody appreciates the fact that I will want to make you a bottle of chutney. Yet, if we connect this to the fact that this is not just me extending my goodwill to you, but me trying to revive an indigenous practice, then perhaps people will appreciate what we're trying to do. So I was wondering, both in terms of your practice as a poet as well as a theorist, what would you say is the role of performance, informal performance, a performance that just dissipates, it goes away after it's done. There's no trace of it left. It is for the moment. And in a minute, I will ask you to perform your poem as well. So could you say something about performance?
The performance part is a very serious part. And I beg to differ from you, because it does not disappear. Say, for example, an act of kindness will never disappear. A gesture of goodwill will not disappear. The person to whom this has been shown will remember. So it is important also to enter from here into interpersonal relationships.
Absolutely.
Okay, how we relate to each other. If performance only means some sort of formal behavior, or just a certain kind of pattern of behavior, or does it have any deeper meaning? If it has deeper meaning, which means that we function or we perform certain acts in our lives out of a sense of responsibility and duty. And that is not a small thing. I have known, and I have done it myself also, I have been extremely kind, and I consider compassion to be one of the most important virtues that we must practice if we have to survive. And it has to be performed. It is not something that you can only imagine that I'm a compassionate person without ever performing an act of compassion, right? Yeah. So if we take performance at that level, it is absolutely necessary. And we should build communities, we should build interpersonal relationships on the basis of this kind of, there are certain liberal values like tolerance, toleration. We should tolerate each other, not be violent. I mean, the violence has become, violence is pathogen, basically. Violence is virus, I tell you. This is what it is if you metaphorically want to talk about it. Violent attitude and violent behavior towards others, and others means the benchmark for othering would be anything: caste, class, gender, ethnicity, just you name it, color, race. All of that has got to be thought through, not only by creating a system of interpersonal behavior based on rights, because they don't work. You have to make room for compassion, toleration, for performance to become meaningful. Exactly. This is the first thing. The second thing is, performance is not something that you perform for one time, just for once. No. It is a continuous thing. So the performance, if you are in the realm of deep notions of performance, then it is a continuous behavioral thing, attitude that we have to bring it into our lives. I mean, I have to think of people, people around me, for example. I do not see them ever being compassionate to the maid that they employ. The washerwoman who irons our clothes in summer, she would come only to my house asking for water, safe water, drinking water. And once I asked him, why do you always ask me for this kindness? Because in summer, the temperature is 42, 43 degrees. And if you don't give water to somebody, which means you are quite unkind. And she told me that no one in this whole building gives me water. Water to drink, something that is basically you would give to birds, you will give to dogs. Why would you deny this to this woman? So what I'm saying is that it is a matter of not only imagining that I'm kind, it's a matter of performing. That is where performance is very, very important, because it becomes part of your behavior, which arises from a sense of responsibility and duty. That kind of basis for performance is something that is absolutely necessary for us to transition into a new society, a new time, where where we would recognize each other as human beings, as I mean, sense of humanity that we've been imagining for a very long time that we have, that we will take it to all kinds of animals and creatures, and we will not kill, we will not, killing animals, for example, making a habit, industrial habit of killing animals and eating, something that has to be thought through. This violence, if you're shown to that animal, enters into your body if you keep consuming its meat. This is how I believe, I feel.
I agree.
Right, the cry of that animal it enters into your soul. It really, really damages you, and you don't realize, because you don't realize its consequences immediately. But look at the total consequences of this kind of behavior has brought us into most unkind, most unfathomable relationship with nature today. Sure. So performance has an extraordinary role to play, because it shapes our interpersonal relationships. It makes us ethical beings, realize ethical needs that we have. It's not that we don't feel that we should be ethical. Mm-hmm. In the kind of condition that we're living, being kind is unviable. You don't have enough to show your kindness to others. But those who have, if they don't practice it, then it will not be practiced at all.
There is one other aspect of performance that I wanted to bring up, and that is the repetition of it. So, my mother, who passed away recently, had this practice that every Tuesday she would make something sweet and distribute it to the kids in her neighborhood. Wherever she lived, she was known for the lady who distributed the laddu or whatever she made every Tuesday. And so a group of children would collect at her doorstep, and if ever she forgot, they would never let her forget. Auntie, aaj Tuesday, aapne laddu nahi banaye. So this was her way of keeping up the performance and the practice. And she was committed, and one must be committed. It's not that, once in a while I may choose to cook something and distribute it, but there should be a continuity to it. So in that same vein, I have decided, and I have been committed to making kheer rice pudding, kheer, every Amavas and every full moon. So I make the kheer in a different way. I distribute it to different people. People have not yet started to come to my doorstep asking for kheer, but I definitely make it, and then I look for people to find who would appreciate it. So in this way, performance becomes a ritual. That means that there is a repetitiveness to it. The re of ritual is taken actually from the re of ritu, which is cyclical and seasonal. So there should be a commitment to this, that it's not that I will do this when I feel like it, but I will do this with a certain system of continuity. Then the other thing is that in the act of exchange, let's call it, I give and others receive, but they also give their appreciation, which I receive. There is a certain community that's built. You know, the children used to come to my mother, come rain or shine, come whatever, they would turn up at her doorstep on every Tuesday. So there is also a sense of responsibility to that, you know, I cannot let these people down. I may not be feeding them, you know, roti or whatever, but I do measure up to a certain expectation that they begin to have of me, let's say every Amavas and every Purnamashi. So that commitment has to be there. So let's turn to another aspect of this COVID phase that we're in, and the damage that it has done to our sense of community. I mean, it was fraying to begin with, you know, but now with social distancing and curfews and lockdowns, that sense of community has further weakened. What can we do to revive a sense of community?
First of all, I must tell you, Poonam, that during the pandemic, when the workers were heading home, simply running away, the individual acts of kindness was not wanting. There were just so many people who came to help them. It's another matter that these things have not been highlighted. You know, the media is one place where I think it's the most toxic place now, because it's just so in tune with falsehood and so much away from truth that, you know, it's like very corrupting kind of a medium it has become. It should show how people have helped, because the government was not in position to help did not mean that others were not helping. The communities were not acting. It was not like that. It was because the state is a dominant institution. If it is unkind, if it is unable to solve this problem, does not mean people don't have solutions. People do have. After all, how do you think these people manage to reach home without any help? It's not true.
No.
People help them everywhere. I mean, the writers, painters, civil activists, social activists, you name it, and you'll find that people in the private capacity, in the civil society capacity, were always there to help. So the community, sense of community was challenged, but its vitality was tested, and I can tell you that it has not failed. The community sense is very much stronger, and more so now, because now the pandemic is coming one after the other, which only goes to show that we change the system of production. Otherwise, it will not go. That is to say, either capitalism comes up with a benign form, its own benign form. It has already pushed at least the neoliberal state into neoliberal capitalism into kind of a benign form, because the state is back into play. See, state was pushed away, the market was everywhere. And that's when all these things have happened. Irresponsible greed taking over, you know, resulting into this pandemic. So the state is back. The state has to look at if you read through the entire episodes of vaccine and this and that, how many times state had to intervene to regularize it, to make it a kind of a convincing option for people to survive. No, I don't think any one particular vaccine company would have convinced people to take vaccine. It was not possible. It's the state that has entered and brought its moral authority and its financial authority through its institution that has made people to go and take the vaccine. Otherwise, it was not possible. It would not have been possible. In a similar way, if you look at the present democratic regime in America, they are now in the mode of taxing the super rich, which was a religion. Not to tax them had become a religion in America and other parts of Europe. All right,
Yes.
That phase is over. Corporates have to take responsibility of production of carbon and toxicity that is the byproduct of all other kinds of production processes that we are in. So they are being made responsible. In Europe as well, you will find that this kind of rethinking is going on. That meaning to say that not only community, but the state itself is being refashioned to cope with this. So people and state coming together, they have to come together and form a consensus that the older ways of dealing with nature, dealing with other people, dealing with their labor is not going to work. People are not cheap labor. Right? Colored people are not cheapest labor. Asian people are not just the cheap labor. See, they're human beings. So this consideration, I mean, India has helped during pandemic. It has helped, India helped America in terms of vaccine. If you remember, the whole thing was reversed, which created another problem for us over here. But what I'm saying is that there is a change of attitude and behavior. People are thinking that they have to alter their ways of life, but they have to think deeper. They have to have a real sense of what Gandhi used to say, disobedience to greed, disobedience to overproduction, and disobedience to waste. We cannot waste even one grain of earth now. We have to respect this habitat that we have. We take only as much as we need, and our needs should not be based on profit. It should be based on what I've been calling and what Marx has himself called use value. Use what you need. Don't produce unnecessarily. And if you produce so much, then distribute. Give it to people who need it. There are a lot of people who need very basic stuff, but they don't get it because of the system and the way the system is produces and distributes. So I think that there is a rethinking that is going on. There are alternative ways of living and doing. But the real problem is the corporates, because they're very powerful. They have a lot of money. You see, there is a data that I want to share with you. This is about India. Okay, it says in a country where 63 families have more assets than the total annual budget of the country. This is India. And where the total wealth of 9 people is equal to the wealth of 50% of country's population. So Poonam, I'm sorry to say that this is the reality. I don't want to name these 60 families or 9 families for Corona, but this is the reality. This is the reality. This inequality is intolerable. This inequality gives preponderance power to just some few people who take decisions, make policies, bring in modes of production and reproduction and distribution. That's where we have to enter and sort of crack the monopoly into pieces, allow people to enter, democracy to deepen, and people take decisions at wherever they are. Why somebody else should take decisions for you without having any compassion for your lifestyle, whether your children are hungry, whether they're going to school, whether there are some schools nearby or not, without thinking of any of these. You make policies of education for the nation. it is very important that we think this way. That's how we will be able to transition into, and it is happening. I'm not saying that it is not happening. It's not a sermon that I'm giving. I'm simply saying that we have to look at wherever it is happening and accepting it and going further with it.
And yet, I'm in complete agreement with you. I feel that the connectedness that came from interdependence in a moment, in a lifestyle when everything was scarce and everybody had just about as much as they needed, if not less. That interdependence has been frayed, because if X has a little bit more than she needs, X wants to keep that for herself rather than sharing, because she fears that tomorrow she may not be able to buy the vegetables, or tomorrow there may be a shortage of gas cylinders, or the insecurity is making me selfish. That if today I grew potatoes and I have more than what I need for this season, I would naturally have given them away. But now I'm thinking, maybe I can preserve them, maybe I can freeze them, maybe I can can them, rather than giving them away to my next door neighbor. So there is a certain level of insecurity that has led to the fraying of the connectedness that was the basis of community, right?
Poonam, now that we're talking about all this, think of, even 20 years back in this country, people used to keep their children's clothes, because children's clothes, the children grow up very quickly, and they would give it to a family, a relative, where a new child has been born, and nobody would mind. It was shared, all right? So what I am saying is that this virtue of sharing, which was natural, people did not mind taking old clothes and all that. Even that kind of thing is becoming what was an act of sharing has become an act of insulting. People will feel insulted if you give old clothes. You see how capitalism, how this new culture of commodity consumption, for example, has made change our values also. So there are many facets to it. It's not only just the insecurity. Insecurity, of course, has been instilled because jobs are not secure, the income is not secure. If majority of people live without any sense of security in terms of income, and that is because there are only just few who have security. That insecurity and security have disproportionate relationship. That happens, then obviously it is this insecurity that will be shared, not compassion, not generosity. Those things have to be understood. I remember in the village when my grandfather owned orchards. So in the season of mangoes, a lot of mangoes would come. Obviously, it was far beyond the level of consumption. I mean, we couldn't consume that many mangoes. So I remember very clearly, days after days, the sacks will be filled with mangoes to be sent to distant relatives and in the villages, to just about anybody who was working with you. It will be shared, right? I do not know whether it happens now, because there'll be someone to tell you that why are you sharing it? Take it to the market. There's no shame in selling your own product in the market. Whereas there was a sense of shame at that time, I remember, of selling off your products instead of sharing, all right? So those things have obviously changing, and it is making life so much poorer, I would say. And market has no compassion. It's a set of calculations, isn't it? And either you pass there or you fail. Either you make profit or you make loss. That kind of relationship is prospering, and market is helping. So I would say that wherever alternative practices are somehow breathing. We should take it seriously. We should practice it at a local level, and at the national and international level. We should fight capitalism. We should fight corporatism. There is just no way out. Feminists have to fight, and ordinary people have to fight. And fighting could be just not violence. What I mean is simple Gandhian method of disobedience. Just don't buy too many things.
Yes, exactly.
Just don't buy. Buy only what you need. That's it.
Yeah. Even in starting this chat show, whenever I mention the fact that I'm starting this chat show because I have nobody to talk to, nobody to talk with me. Why not start a chat show and highlight certain themes and ideas? The first thing people ask is how will you generate profit? And I keep saying, I don't need to generate profit. I'm not doing it for profit. I'm doing it for an alternative economy of community. I'm not doing it for profit.
We are circulating old words. We're not producing new words. All right. We're not producing new words. Circulating old words with great meaning. And
we're giving new meaning to those words in a different context. I mean, storytelling is an old tradition. Asking people to tell their stories is a very old tradition. But because it's not happening during curfew and COVID lockdown and restricted movements and social distancing, for me, this is the next best thing. I ask my friends or people I find interesting and say, come and chat with me. And I will circulate it. It is to fill a vacuum. There is indeed a vacuum in communication, at least in the urban context that I live in. I cannot just walk into somebody's house. Nobody can just come and have a cup of tea with me. I miss the fact that nobody comes to have tea with me. And so actually my practice is that in this show, we talk to each other over a cup of tea. My cup of tea is sitting right beside me.
Even mine is here, by the way.
That's great. That's great. So this ritual of talking over a cup of tea as the warm water and the aroma relaxes us both is weakening. There may come a time when we don't have this concept of chai and baithak or a salon. So I'm calling this show a salon because there are no more salons left. So we have to create virtual salons. And so you and I have met at a salon over a drink or a cup of cheers, indeed.
Yes,
before I end the show, I really would like you to share a poem or two of yours because that is something that you have created. It is an expression of art, and after we've talked all we want about it, we should also share art. So would you please?
I have a happy news. My new book has come out this month itself. A collection of poems, Hindi poems, called Koi Cheezon Ka Shok. It is about certain kind of inevitable grief after someone whom you have loved has left. So it's dedicated to Pankaj Singh, my husband. But we led a very public, socially meaningful life, as you would know. So this collection also has many such poems. One poem is about the pandemic, about the exodus of the workers from Delhi and other metropolis back to their villages. So maybe I will read that one, and if you like, I'll read one or two more.
That would be lovely.
So the first one is, and I tell you, when people were leaving Delhi, Calcutta, Bangalore, Chennai, Poonam, I really thought that something will happen, something will change, that things have come back to the same situation. But I think that it cannot continue like this. Basic things have to change now, the way we live. Anyway, the poem is दृश्य चलते हैं. यह तो पता न था, यह तो किसी को पता न था, उन्हें भी नहीं जिनके लिए सारी कायनात ने जिनके लिए सारे इंतजामात थे कि एक दिन बुरे सपने की तरह एक जीवाणु उनकी नींद से होता हुआ घुस जाएगा उनके फेफड़े में, उनकी सारी हवा निकाल देगा या कि सोख लेगा प्राण। यह तो पता ना था मजदूर मानुष को कि चलना पड़ेगा अचानक, जीवन को पार करना होगा, इतना चलना होगा, आत्मा को झेलनी होगी ऐसी फजीहत जिसके लिए देह तैयार भी हो जाए, आत्मा तैयार नहीं होती। उसकी स्त्री को भी कहाँ पता था सड़क पर जननी पड़ेगी पेट में पल रही बच्ची को, बावजूद इसके चलना पड़ेगा 16 कोस आगे, पहुंचने के लिए घर, होश में आने के लिए। उसे क्या पता था बेहोशी में भी एक औरत चल सकती है इतनी दूर, जबकि वह चलती रही है नींद में कब से। उसे तो अब पता चला है कि पूरी जीवन यात्रा एक बेहोशी ही थी, वरना झेलती कैसे वह अब तक के सारे अत्याचार, खाली चूल्हे और बुझी आग। आखिर वह कैसे भरती पेट बच्चों के। वह एक बेहोशी की ही तरह रही होगी, अलबत्ता अपनी तरह की, जिसमें एक स्त्री ने सुलाया होगा अपने बच्चे को सूटकेस पर और खींचती हुई जैसे कोई किसी पूरी पृथ्वी को कोसों बढ़ती गई होगी घर की ओर। इस यात्रा में कितनी बची रही है वह मनुष्य और कितना बचा रहा है जीवाणु, यह किसी को क्या पता। लेकिन इतना भी नहीं है यह रहस्य, लोगों को पता है अपने शासकों की अंतहीन क्रूरता का सबब अब, जिन्होंने देखे यह दृश्य, जनसैलाब का पैरों पैरों चलते जाना। लोगों ने जाना पहली बार कि सामान्य दृश्य भी चलते हैं। 5 दफा उनके पांव भी होते हैं कि वे भी कुचल सकते हैं, कुचले ही नहीं जाते रहेंगे हर दफा।
बहुत खूब, बहुत। I think we will end with that. मैं आपको बहुत धन्यवाद कहना चाहती हूँ। आपने इस शो को बहुत शान दी है और I wish you the very best both in your artistic practice, in your compassion, in your community building, and of course in your academic work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on this show.
It's my pleasure.